Milton Friedman was an American economist, statistician, and writer who taught at the University of Chicago for more than 3 decades. He was a recipient of the 1976 Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences, and is known for his research on consumption analysis, monetary history and theory, and the complexity of stabilization policy. As a leader of the Chicago School of Economics, he profoundly influenced the research agenda of the economics profession. A survey of economists ranked Friedman as the second most popular economist of the 20th century after John Maynard Keynes, and The Economist described him as the most influential economist of the second half of the 20th century. Possibly of all of it. Friedman's challenges to what he later called naive Keynesian theory began with his 1950s reinterpretation of the consumption function, and he became the main advocate opposing activist Keynesian government policies. In the late 1960s, he described his own approach as using Keynesian language and apparatus yet rejecting its initial conclusions. During the 1960s, he promoted an alternative macroeconomic policy known as monetarism. He theorized there existed a natural rate of unemployment and argued that governments could increase employment above this rate, for example, by increasing aggregate demand, only at the risk of causing inflation to accelerate. He argued that the Phillips curve was not stable and predicted what would come to be known as stagflation. Though opposed to the existence of the Federal Reserve System, Friedman argued that, given that it does exist, a steady, small expansion of the money supply was the only wise policy. Friedman was an economic advisor to Republican U.S. President Ronald Reagan. His political philosophy extolled the virtues of a free market economic system with minimal intervention. He once stated that his role in eliminating U.S. conscription was his proudest accomplishment, and his support for school choice led him to found the Friedman Foundation for Educational Choice. In his 1962 book Capitalism and Freedom, Friedman advocated policies such as a volunteer military, freely floating exchange rates, abolition of medical licenses, a negative income tax, and school vouchers. His ideas concerning monetary policy, taxation, privatization and deregulation influenced government policies, especially during the 1980s. His monetary theory influenced the Federal Reserve's response to the global financial crisis of 2007-08. In the field of statistics, Friedman developed the sequential sampling method of analysis. Milton Friedman's works include many monographs, books, scholarly articles, papers, magazine columns, television programs, videos, and lectures, and cover a broad range of topics of microeconomics, macroeconomics, economic history, and public policy issues. His books and essays were widely read, and have had an international influence, including in former communist states. Early life: Friedman was born in Brooklyn, New York, to recent Jewish immigrants Sarah Ethel and Gina Saul Friedman, from Baraksy in Carpathian Ruthenia, Kingdom of Hungary, both of whom worked as dry goods merchants. Shortly after Milton's birth, the family relocated to Rahway, New Jersey. In his early teens, Friedman was injured in a car accident, which scarred his upper lip. A talented student, Friedman graduated from Rahway High School in 1928, just before his 16th birthday. In 1932 Friedman graduated from Rutgers University, where he specialized in mathematics and economics and initially intended to become an actuary. During his time at Rutgers, Friedman became influenced by 2 economics professors, Arthur F. Burns and Homer Jones, who convinced him that modern economics could help end the Great Depression. After graduating from Rutgers, Friedman was offered 2 scholarships to do graduate work one in mathematics at Brown University and the other in economics at the University of Chicago. Friedman chose the latter, thus earning a Master of Arts degree in 1933. He was strongly influenced by Jacob Viner, Frank Knight, and Henry Simons. It was at Chicago that Friedman met his future wife, economist Rose Director. During the 1933-1934 academic year he had a fellowship at Columbia University, where he studied statistics with renowned statistician and economist Harold Hotelling. He was back in Chicago for the 1934–1935 academic year, working as a research assistant for Henry Schultz, who was then working on theory and measurement of demand. That year, Friedman formed what would prove to be lifelong friendships with George Stigler and W. Allen Wallace. Public service: Friedman was initially unable to find academic employment, so in 1935 he followed his friend W. Allen Wallace to Washington, where Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal was a lifesaver for many young economists. At this stage, Friedman said that he and his wife regarded the job creation programs such as the WPA, CCC, and PWA appropriate responses to the critical situation, but not the price and wage-fixing measures of the National Recovery Administration and the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. Foreshadowing his later ideas, he believed price controls interfered with an essential signaling mechanism to help resources be used where they were most valued. Indeed, Friedman later concluded that all government intervention associated with the New Deal was the wrong cure for the wrong disease, arguing that the money supply should simply have been expanded, instead of contracted. In the publication, A Monetary History of the United States, 1867–1960 by Friedman and Anna J. Schwartz, they argue that the Great Depression was caused by monetary contraction, which was the consequence of poor policy-making by the Federal Reserve System and the continuous crises of the banking system. During 1935, he began work for the National Resources Committee, which was then working on a large consumer budget survey. Ideas from this project later became a part of his theory of the consumption function. Friedman began employment with the National Bureau of Economic Research during autumn 1937 to assist Simon Kzitz in his work on professional income. This work resulted in their jointly authored publication Incomes from Independent Professional Practice, which introduced the concepts of permanent and transitory income, a major component of the permanent income hypothesis that Friedman worked out in greater detail in the 1950s. The book hypothesizes that professional licensing artificially restricts the supply of services and raises prices. During 1940, Friedman was appointed an assistant professor teaching economics at the University of Wisconsin–Madison, but encountered anti-Semitism in the economics department and decided to return to government service. From 1941 to 1943 Friedman worked on wartime tax policy for the federal government, as an advisor to senior officials of the United States Department of the Treasury. As a Treasury spokesman during 1942 he advocated a Keynesian policy of taxation. He helped to invent the payroll withholding tax system, since the federal government badly needed money in order to fight the war. He later said, "I have no apologies for it, but I really wish we hadn't found it necessary and I wish there was some way of abolishing withholding now." Academic career, early years: in 1940, Friedman accepted a position at the University of Wisconsin–Madison, but left because of differences with faculty regarding United States involvement in World War II. Friedman believed the United States should enter the war. In 1943, Friedman joined the Division of War Research at Columbia University, where he spent the rest of World War II working as a mathematical statistician, focusing on problems of weapons design, military tactics, and metallurgical experiments. In 1945, Friedman submitted Incomes from Independent Professional Practice to Columbia as his doctoral dissertation. The university awarded him a Ph.D. in 1946. Friedman spent the 1945–1946 academic year teaching at the University of Minnesota. On February 12, 1945, his son, David D. Friedman was born. University of Chicago. In 1946, Friedman accepted an offer to teach economic theory at the University of Chicago. Friedman would work for the University of Chicago for the next 30 years. There he contributed to the establishment of an intellectual community that produced a number of Nobel Prize winners, known collectively as the Chicago School of Economics. At that time, Arthur F. Burns, who was then the head of the National Bureau of Economic Research, asked Friedman to rejoin the Bureau's staff. He accepted the invitation, and assumed responsibility for the Bureau's inquiry into the role of money in the business cycle. As a result, he initiated the workshop in Money in Banking, which promoted a revival of monetary studies. During the latter half of the 1940s, Friedman began a collaboration with Anna Schwartz, an economic historian at the Bureau, that would ultimately result in the 1963 publication of a book co-authored by Friedman and Schwartz, A Monetary History of the United States, 1867–1960. Friedman spent the 1954–1955 academic year as a Fulbright visiting fellow at Gonville and Caius College, Cambridge. At the time, the Cambridge economics faculty was divided into a Keynesian majority and an anti-Keynesian minority. Friedman speculated that he was invited to the fellowship, because his views were unacceptable to both of the Cambridge factions. Later his weekly columns for Newsweek magazine were well read and increasingly influential among political and business people. From 1968 to 1978, he and Paul Samuelson participated in the Economics Cassette Series, a bi-weekly subscription series where The Economist would discuss the day's issues for about a half hour at a time. Friedman was an economic advisor to Republican presidential candidate Barry Goldwater during 1964. Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences, Friedman won the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences, the sole recipient for 1976, for his achievements in the fields of consumption analysis, monetary history and theory, and for his demonstration of the complexity of stabilization policy. Retirement. In 1977, at the age of 65, Friedman retired from the University of Chicago after teaching there for 30 years. He and his wife moved to San Francisco, where he became a visiting scholar at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. From 1977 on, he was affiliated with the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. During the same year, Friedman was approached by the Free to Choose network and asked to create a television program presenting his economic and social philosophy. The Friedmans worked on this project for the next 3 years, and during 1980, the 10-part series, titled Free to Choose, was broadcast by the Public Broadcasting Service. The companion book to the series, also titled Free to Choose, was the best-selling non-fiction book of 1980 and has since been translated into 14 foreign languages. Friedman served as an unofficial advisor to Ronald Reagan during his 1980 presidential campaign, and then served on the President's Economic Policy Advisory Board for the rest of the Reagan administration. In 1988 he received the National Medal of Science and Reagan honored him with the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Milton Friedman is known now as one of the most influential economists of the 20th century. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Friedman continued to write editorials and appear on television. He made several visits to Eastern Europe and to China, where he also advised governments. He was also for many years a trustee of the Philadelphia Society. Scholarly contributions. Economics. Friedman was best known for reviving interest in the money supply as a determinant of the nominal value of output, that is, the quantity theory of money. Monetarism is the set of views associated with modern quantity theory. Its origins can be traced back to the 16th century school of Salamanca or even further. However, Friedman's contribution is largely responsible for its modern popularization. He co-authored, with Anna Schwartz, A Monetary History of the United States, 1867–1960, which was an examination of the role of the money supply and economic activity in the U.S. history. A striking conclusion of their research was regarding the way in which money supply fluctuations are contributing to economic fluctuations. Several regression studies with David Meyer-Selman during the 1960s suggested the primacy of the money supply over investment and government spending in determining consumption and output. These challenged a prevailing but largely untested view on their relative importance. Friedman's empirical research and some theory supported the conclusion that the short-run effect of a change of the money supply was primarily on output but that the longer-run effect was primarily on the price level. Friedman was the main proponent of the monetarist school of economics. He maintained that there is a close and stable association between price inflation and the money supply, mainly that price inflation should be regulated with monetary deflation and price deflation with monetary inflation. He famously quipped that price deflation can be fought by dropping money out of a helicopter. Friedman's arguments were designed to counter popular claims that price inflation at the time was the result of increases in the price of oil, or increases in wages. As he wrote, "Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon." Friedman rejected the use of fiscal policy as a tool of demand management. And he held that the government's role in the guidance of the economy should be restricted severely. Friedman wrote extensively on the Great Depression, which he termed the Great Contraction, arguing that it had been caused by an ordinary financial shock whose duration and seriousness were greatly increased by the subsequent contraction of the money supply caused by the misguided policies of the directors of the Federal Reserve. The Fed was largely responsible for converting what might have been a garden-variety recession, although perhaps a fairly severe one, into a major catastrophe. Instead of using its powers to offset the depression, it presided over a decline in the quantity of money by one-third from 1929 to 1933. Far from the depression being a failure of the free enterprise system, it was a tragic failure of government. Friedman also argued for the cessation of government intervention in currency markets, thereby spawning an enormous literature on the subject, as well as promoting the practice of freely floating exchange rates. His close friend George Stigler explained, as is customary in science, he did not win a full victory, in part because research was directed along different lines by the theory of rational expectations, a newer approach developed by Robert Lucas, also at the University of Chicago. Friedman was also known for his work on the consumption function, the permanent income hypothesis, which Friedman himself referred to as his best scientific work. This work contended that rational consumers would spend a proportional amount of what they perceived to be their permanent income. Windfall gains would mostly be saved. Tax reductions likewise, as rational consumers would predict that taxes would have to increase later to balance public finances. Other important contributions include his critique of the Phillips curve and the concept of the natural rate of unemployment. This critique associated his name, together with that of Edmund Phelps, with the insight that a government that brings about greater inflation cannot permanently reduce unemployment by doing so. Unemployment may be temporarily lower, if the inflation is a surprise, but in the long run unemployment will be determined by the frictions and imperfections of the labor market. Friedman's essay The Methodology of Positive Economics provided the epistemological pattern for his own subsequent research and to a degree that of the Chicago School. There he argued that economics as science should be free of value judgments for it to be objective. Moreover, a useful economic theory should be judged not by its descriptive realism but by its simplicity and fruitfulness as an engine of prediction. That is, students should measure the accuracy of its predictions, rather than the soundness of its assumptions. His argument was part of an ongoing debate among such statisticians as Jerzy Neyman, Leonard Savage, and Ronald Fisher. Statistics. One of his most famous contributions to statistics is sequential sampling. Friedman did statistical work at the Division of War Research at Columbia. He and his colleagues came up with a sampling technique, known as sequential sampling, which became, in the words of the New Palgrave Dictionary of Economics, the standard analysis of quality control inspection. The dictionary adds, like many of Friedman's unregistered trademark-esque contributions, in retrospect it seems remarkably simple and obvious to apply basic economic ideas to quality control. That however is a measure of his genius. Public policy positions. Federal Reserve. Friedman believed that the Federal Reserve should be abolished, but if the money supply was to be centrally controlled, that the preferable way to do it would be with a mechanical system that would keep the quantity of money increasing at a steady rate. However, instead of government involvement at all, he was open to a real, non-government, gold standard where money is produced by the private market. A real gold standard is thoroughly consistent with classical liberal principles, and I, for one, am entirely in favor of measures promoting its development. He did however add this caveat: let me emphasize that this note is not a plea for a return to a gold standard. I regard a return to a gold standard as neither desirable nor feasible with the one exception that it might become feasible if the doomsday predictions of hyperinflation under our present system should prove correct. He said the reason that it was not feasible was because there is essentially no government in the world that is willing to surrender control over its domestic monetary policy. However, it could be done if you could re-establish a world in which government's budget accounted for 10% of the national income, in which laissez-faire reigned, in which governments did not interfere with economic activities and in which full employment policies had been relegated to the dustbiner. Friedman was considered sympathetic to free banking. He was critical of the Federal Reserve's influence on the economics profession. In a 1993 letter to University of Texas economics professor and former House Banking Committee investigator Robert Auerbach, Friedman wrote, "I cannot disagree with you that having something like 500 economists is extremely unhealthy. As you say, it is not conducive to independent, objective research. You and I know there has been censorship of the material published. Equally important, the location of the economists in the Federal Reserve has had a significant influence on the kind of research they do, biasing that research toward non-controversial technical papers on method as opposed to substantive papers on policy and results." School choice. In his 1955 article The Role of Government in Education, Friedman proposed supplementing publicly operated schools with privately run but publicly funded schools through a system of school vouchers. Reforms similar to those proposed in the article were implemented in, for example, Chile in 1981 and Sweden in 1992. In 1996, Friedman, together with his wife, founded the Foundation for Educational Choice to advocate school choice and vouchers. Conscription. Milton Friedman was a major proponent of a volunteer military, stating that the draft was inconsistent with a free society. In Capitalism and Freedom, he argued that conscription is inequitable and arbitrary, preventing young men from shaping their lives as they see fit. During the Nixon administration he headed the committee to research a conversion to paid volunteer armed force. He would later state that his role in eliminating the conscription in the United States was his proudest accomplishment. Friedman did, however, believe a nation could compel military training as a reserve in case of wartime. Foreign policy. Biographer Lanny Ebenstein noted a drift over time in Friedman's views from an interventionist to a more cautious foreign policy. He supported U.S. involvement in the Second World War and initially supported a hard line against communism, but moderated over time. He opposed the Gulf War and the Iraq War. In a spring 2006 interview, Friedman said that the USA's stature in the world had been eroded by the Iraq War, but that it might be improved if Iraq were to become a peaceful independent country. Libertarianism and the Republican Party. He served as a member of President Reagan's Economic Policy Advisory Board starting at 1981. In 1988, he received the Presidential Medal of Freedom and the National Medal of Science. He said that he was a libertarian philosophically, but a member of the U.S. Republican Party for the sake of expediency, but, he said, "I think the term classical liberal is also equally applicable. I don't really care very much what I'm called. I'm much more interested in having people thinking about the ideas, rather than the person." Public goods and monopoly. Friedman was supportive of the state provision of some public goods that private businesses are not considered as being able to provide. However, he argued that many of the services performed by government could be performed better by the private sector. Above all, if some public goods are provided by the state, he believed that they should not be a legal monopoly where private competition is prohibited. For example, he wrote, "There is no way to justify our present public monopoly of the post office. It may be argued that the carrying of mail is a technical monopoly and that a government monopoly is the least of evils. Along these lines, one could perhaps justify a government post office, but not the present law, which makes it illegal for anybody else to carry the mail. If the delivery of mail is a technical monopoly, no one else will be able to succeed in competition with the government. If it is not, there is no reason why the government should be engaged in it. The only way to find out is to leave other people free to enter." Social Security, welfare programs, and negative income tax. After 1960, Friedman attacked Social Security from a free market view, stating that it had created welfare dependency. Friedman proposed the replacement of the existing U.S. welfare system with a negative income tax. a progressive tax system in which the poor receive a basic living income from the government. According to the New York Times, Friedman's views in this regard were grounded in a belief that while market forces accomplish wonderful things, they cannot ensure a distribution of income that enables all citizens to meet basic economic needs. Drug policy. Friedman also supported libertarian policies such as legalization of drugs and prostitution. During 2005, Friedman and more than 500 other economists advocated discussions regarding the economic benefits of the legalization of marijuana. LGBT rights. Friedman was also a supporter of gay rights. He specifically supported same-sex marriage, saying on the issue, "I do not believe there should be any discrimination against gays." Economic freedom. Michael Walker of the Fraser Institute and Friedman hosted a series of conferences from 1986 to 1994. The goal was to create a clear definition of economic freedom and a method for measuring it. Eventually this resulted in the first report on worldwide economic freedom, Economic Freedom in the World, 1. This annual report has since provided data for numerous peer-reviewed studies and has influenced policy in several nations. Along with 16 other distinguished economists, he opposed the Copyright Term Extension Act and filed an amicus brief in Eldred v. Ashcroft. He supported the inclusion of the word no-brainer in the brief. Friedman argued for stronger basic legal protection of economic rights and freedoms in order to further promote industrial commercial growth and prosperity and buttress democracy and freedom and the rule of law generally in society. Honors, recognition, and influence. George H. Nash, a leading historian of American conservatism, says that by the end of the 1960s he was probably the most highly regarded and influential conservative scholar in the country, and one of the few with an international reputation. Friedman allowed the libertarian Cato Institute to use his name for its biannual Milton Friedman Prize for Advancing Liberty beginning in 2001. A Friedman Prize was given to the late British economist Peter Bauer in 2002, Peruvian economist Hernando de Soto in 2004, Mart Bla, former Estonian Prime Minister in 2006 and a young Venezuelan student John Goicoechea in 2008. His wife Rose, sister of Aaron director, with whom he initiated the Friedman Foundation for Educational Choice, served on the International Selection Committee. Friedman was also a recipient of the Nobel Prize in Economics. Upon the death of Friedman, Harvard President Lawrence Summers called Friedman the Great Liberator, saying, "Any honest Democrat will admit that we are now all Friedmanites." He said Friedman's great popular contribution was in convincing people of the importance of allowing free markets to operate. In 2013, Stephen Moore, a member of the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, said, quoting the most revered champion of free market economics since Adam Smith has become a little like quoting the Bible. He adds, there are sometimes multiple and conflicting interpretations. Hong Kong, Friedman once said, if you want to see capitalism in action, go to Hong Kong. He wrote in 1990 that the Hong Kong economy was perhaps the best example of a free market economy. 1 month before his death, he wrote the article Hong Kong Wrong a Euro, What Would Cooperthwaite Say? In the Wall Street Journal, criticizing Donald Tsang, the chief executive of Hong Kong, for abandoning positive non-interventionism. Tsang later said he was merely changing the slogan to Big Market, Small Government, where small government is defined as less than 20% of GDP. In a debate between Tsang and his rival, Alan Leong, before the 2007 chief executive election, Leong introduced the topic and jokingly accused Tsang of angering Friedman to death. Chile. During 1975, 2 years after the military coup that brought military dictator President Augusto Pinochet to power and ended the government of Salvador Allende, the economy of Chile experienced a severe crisis. Friedman and Arnold Harberger accepted an invitation of a private Chilean foundation to visit Chile and speak on principles of economic freedom. He spent 7 days in Chile giving a series of lectures at the Universidad Católica de Chile and the University of Chile. One of the lectures was entitled The Fragility of Freedom, and according to Friedman, dealt with precisely the threat to freedom from a centralized military government. During his visit, Friedman met with Pinochet, who asked him for his opinions about Chile's economic situation and policies. In an April 21, 1975, letter to Pinochet that Friedman wrote to comply with Pinochet's request, Friedman considered the key economic problems of Chile are clearly inflation and the promotion of a healthy social markets economy. He stated that there is only one way to end inflation, by drastically reducing the rate of increase of the quantity of money, and that cutting government spending is by far and away the most desirable way to reduce the fiscal deficit, because it strengthens the private sector, thereby laying the foundations for healthy economic growth. As to how rapidly inflation should be ended, Friedman felt that for Chile, where inflation is raging at 10 to 20% among the gradualism is not feasible. It would involve so painful an operation over so long a period that the patient would not survive. Choosing a brief period of higher unemployment was the lesser evil, and that the experience of Germany, of Brazil, of the post-war adjustment in the USA, all argue for shock treatment. In the letter, Friedman recommended to deliver what the shock approach with a package to eliminate the surprise and to relieve acute distress, and for definiteness let me sketch the contents of a package proposal. To be taken as illustrative, although his knowledge of Chile was too limited to enable him to be precise or comprehensive. He listed a sample proposal of 8 monetary and fiscal measures, including the removal of as many as obstacles as possible that now hinder the private market. For example, suspend the present law against discharging employees. He closed, stating such a shock program could end inflation in months. His letter suggested that cutting spending to reduce the fiscal deficit would result in less transitional unemployment than raising taxes. Sergio de Castro, a Chilean Chicago School graduate, became the nation's Minister of Finance in 1971. During his 6-year tenure, foreign investment increased, restrictions were placed on striking and labor unions, and GDP rose yearly. A foreign exchange program was created between the Catholic University of Chile and the University of Chicago. Many other Chicago School alumni were appointed government posts during and after the Pinochet years. Others taught its economic doctrine at Chilean universities. They became known as the Chicago Boys. Friedman did not criticize Pinochet's dictatorship at the time, nor the assassinations, illegal imprisonments, torture, or other atrocities that were well known by then. In 1976, Friedman defended his unofficial advisor position with, "I do not consider it as evil for an economist to render technical economic advice to the Chilean government, any more than I would regard it as evil for a physician to give technical medical advice to the Chilean government to help end a medical plague." Friedman defended his activity in Chile on the grounds that, in his opinion, the adoption of free market policies not only improved the economic situation of Chile but also contributed to the amelioration of Pinochet's rule and to the eventual transition to a democratic government during 1990. That idea is included in Capitalism and Freedom, in which he declared that economic freedom is not only desirable in itself but is also a necessary condition for political freedom. In his 1980 documentary Free to Choose, he said the following: "Chile is not a politically free system, and I do not condone the system. But the people there are freer than the people in communist societies because government plays a smaller role. The conditions of the people in the past few years has been getting better and not worse. They would be still better to get rid of the junta and to be able to have a free democratic system." In 1984, Friedman stated that he has never refrained from criticizing the political system in Chile. In 1991 he said, "I have nothing good to say about the political regime that Pinochet imposed. It was a terrible political regime. The real miracle of Chile is not how well it has done economically. The real miracle of Chile is that a military junta was willing to go against its principles and support a free market regime designed by principled believers in a free market." In Chile, the drive for political freedom, that was generated by economic freedom and the resulting economic success, ultimately resulted in a referendum that introduced political democracy. Now, at long last, Chile has all three things: political freedom, human freedom and economic freedom. Chile will continue to be an interesting experiment to watch to see whether it can keep all three or whether, now that it has political freedom, that political freedom will tend to be used to destroy or reduce economic freedom. He stressed that the lectures he gave in Chile were the same lectures he later gave in China and other socialist states. During the 2000 PBS documentary The Commanding Heights, Friedman continued to argue that free markets would undermine Pinochet's political centralization and political control, and that criticism over his role in Chile missed his main contention that freer markets resulted in freer people, and that Chile's unfree economy had caused the military government. Friedman suggested that the economic liberalization he advocated caused the end of military rule and a free Chile. Iceland. Friedman visited Iceland during the autumn of 1984, met with important Icelanders and gave a lecture at the University of Iceland on the tyranny of the status quo. He participated in a lively television debate on August 31, 1984 with socialist intellectuals, including Ólafur Ragnar Grimsson, who later became the president of Iceland. When they complained that a fee was charged for attending his lecture at the university and that, hitherto, lectures by visiting scholars had been free of charge, Friedman replied that previous lectures had not been free of charge in a meaningful sense. Lectures always have related costs. What mattered was whether attendees or non-attendees covered those costs. Friedman thought that it was fairer that only those who attended paid. In this discussion, Friedman also stated that he did not receive any money for delivering that lecture. Estonia. Although Friedman never visited Estonia, his book Free to Choose exercised a great influence on that nation's then 32-year-old Prime Minister, Mart Laar, who has claimed that it was the only book on economics he had read before taking office. Laar's reforms are often credited with responsibility for transforming Estonia from an impoverished Soviet republic to the Baltic Tiger. A prime element of Laar's program was introduction of the flat tax. Laar won the 2006 Milton Friedman Prize for Advancing Liberty, awarded by Cato Institute. United Kingdom. After 1950, Friedman was frequently invited to lecture in Britain, and by the 1970s his ideas had gained widespread attention in conservative circles. For example, he was a regular speaker at the Institute of Economic Affairs, a libertarian think tank. Conservative politician Margaret Thatcher closely followed IEA programs and ideas, and met Friedman there in 1978. He also strongly influenced Keith Joseph, who became Thatcher's senior advisor on economic affairs, as well as Alan Walters and Patrick Minford, two other key advisors. Major newspapers, including the Daily Telegraph, The Times, and the Financial Times, all promulgated Friedman's monetarist ideas to British decision-makers. Friedman's ideas strongly influenced Thatcher and her allies when she became Prime Minister in 1979. Criticism. Econometrician David Hendry criticized part of Friedman's and Anna Schwartz's 1982 monetary trends. When asked about it during an interview with Icelandic TV in 1984, Friedman said that the critique applied to a different problem than that which he and Schwartz had tackled, and was thus not relevant, and also pointed to the lack of consequential peer review amongst econometricians on Hendry's work. In 2006, Hendry stated that Friedman was guilty of serious errors of misunderstanding that meant the T-ratios he reported for UK money demand were overstated by nearly 100%, and said that, in a paper published in 1991 with Neil Erickson, he had refuted almost every empirical claim made about UK money demand by Friedman and Schwartz. A 2004 paper updated and confirmed the validity of the Hendry-Erickson findings through 2000. Other criticism. After Friedman's death in 2006, Keynesian Nobel laureate Paul Krugman praised Friedman as a great economist and a great man, and acknowledged his many, widely accepted contributions to empirical economics. Nonetheless, Krugman criticized Friedman, writing that he slipped all too easily into claiming both that markets always work and that only markets work. It's extremely hard to find cases in which Friedman acknowledged the possibility that markets could go wrong, or that government intervention could serve a useful purpose. In her book The Shock Doctrine, Author and social activist Naomi Klein criticized Friedman's ideology and the principles that guided the economic restructuring that followed the military coups in countries such as Chile and Indonesia. Based on the extent to which the application of what she calls neoliberal policies has contributed to income disparities and inequality, both Klein and Noam Chomsky have suggested that the primary role of what they call neoliberalism was as an ideological cover for capital accumulation by multinational corporations. Chilean economist Orlando Letelier asserted that Pinochet's dictatorship resorted to oppression because of popular opposition to Chicago's school policies in Chile. After a 1991 speech on drug legalization, Friedman answered a question on his involvement with the Pinochet regime, saying that he was never an advisor to Pinochet, but that a group of his students at the University of Chicago were involved in Chile's economic reforms. Friedman credited these reforms with high levels of economic growth and with the establishment of democracy that has subsequently occurred in Chile. Personal life. According to a 2007 article in Commentary magazine, his parents were moderately observant, Jews, but Friedman, after an intense burst of childhood piety, rejected religion altogether. He described himself as an agnostic. Friedman wrote extensively of his life and experiences, especially in 1998 in his memoirs with his wife Rose, titled Two Lucky People. He died of heart failure at the age of 94 years in San Francisco on November 16, 2006. He was survived by his wife and their two children, David, who is an anarcho-capitalist economist, and Janet. David's son, Patry Friedman, was the executive director of the Steading Institute from 2008 to 2011. Selected bibliography. A Theory of the Consumption Function, A Program for Monetary Stability 110 pp online version, Capitalism and Freedom, highly influential series of essays that established Friedman's position on major issues of public policy. Excerpts, A Monetary History of the United States, 1867–1960, with Anna J. Schwartz, 1963. Part 3 reprinted as The Great Contraction, The Role of Monetary Policy. American Economic Review, Volume 58, No. 1, ppA 1 Euro 17 JSTO. A Presidential Address to American Economics Association, Inflation and Unemployment, Nobel Lecture, 1977, Journal of Political Economy. Volume 85, ppA 451 Euro 72. JSTOR, Free to Choose, A Personal Statement, with Rose Friedman. Highly influential restatement of policy views, The Essence of Friedman, essays edited by Kurt R. L. Eube, Two Lucky People, Memoirs ISBN 0-226-26414-9 excerpt and text search, Milton Friedman on Economics, selected papers by Milton Friedman, edited by Gary S. Becker, see also. Friedman Euro Savage Utility Function, Friedman Rule, Friedman's K% Rule, Friedman Test, List of economists, List of Jewish Nobel laureates, List of notable Presidential Medal of Freedom recipients, History of Economic Thought, Notes. References, Bernanke, Ben. Essays on the Great Depression. Princeton University Press. ISBN A0-691-11820-5 Butler, A. Milton Friedman. Harriman Economic Essentials. A. Benstein, Alan O. Milton Friedman, A Biography. Friedman, Milton. Two Lucky People, Memoirs. University of Chicago Press. ISBN A0-226-26415-7 Wood, John Cunningham, and Ronald N. Wood, ed., Milton Friedman, Critical Assessments, v. 3. Scroll to chapter preview links. Routledge. Further reading, external links, Milton and Rose Friedman, An Uncommon Couple, works by or about Milton Friedman in libraries, the Milton Friedman Papers at the Hoover Institution Archives, selected bibliography for Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago Library, profile and papers at Research Papers in Economics Repeck, Milton Friedman collected news and commentary at the New York Times, Milton Friedman at the Internet Movie Database. Becker-Friedman Institute at the University of Chicago, The Foundation for Educational Choice, Milton Friedman at Scarlett, Inflation and Unemployment 1976 lecture at nobelprize.org, Nobel Prize acceptance speech, Milton Friedman. The Concise Encyclopedia of Economics. Library of Economics and Liberty 2008. Milton Friedman, Why Not a Volunteer Army? New Individualist Review, Spring 1967, The Social Responsibility of Businesses to Increase Its Profits, Milton Friedman, The New York Times Magazine, September 13, 1970, interview with Milton Friedman, Dominic Streatfeild, May 25, 2000, source material for Cocaine, an unauthorized biography, Milton Friedman vs. The Fed Bailout by Michael Hirsch, Newsweek, July 17, 2009, Four Deformations of the Apocalypse, David Stockman, The New York Times, July 31, 2010, The Case for Free Trade by Milton and Rose Friedman, Roberts, Russ. Milton Friedman Podcasts. EconTalk. Library of Economics and Liberty. Dr. Milton Friedman at Find a Grave, videos, appearances on C-SPAN, booknotes interview with Friedman in the 50th anniversary edition of F.A. Hayek's Road to Serfdom, November 20, 1994. In-depth interview with Friedman, September 3, 2000. A film clip The Open Mind Living Within Our Means is available for free download at the Internet Archive, more. A film clip The Open Mind a Nobel laureate on the American economy is available for free download at the Internet Archive, more. Milton Friedman, Commanding Heights, PBS, October 1, 2000, interview, profile and video, free to choose a PBS TV series by Milton Friedman, Milton Friedman at the Cato Institute, free to choose network, How to Cure Inflation. A Milton Friedman.